Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about design fallbacks. Now I've talked about these before, and in fact I'm answering a question from GidKid100 who asked, can you make a video about fallbacks? What is the process for designing a less resource heavy version of a system or a replacement for a system? I think I talked about this. I know I did design fallbacks heavily during the Outer Worlds, but I had them in previous games, just not so structured. Like, there literally was a section in the design document for the Outer Worlds called Design Fallbacks. And by the way, when I talk about design document, there are some people out there that still think I'm talking about I have a paper document or a Word doc. The Outer Worlds one was spread across multiple web pages. We used Confluence that were constantly edited and interlinked. So it was like a living document. So if you went to a page, you could not only see the design, but you could see people's comments on it. You could see who was assigned to it. If you clicked on that, you could go through even to schedules and see an idea of when this thing would be made. Anyway, I've talked about design fallbacks before. A design fallback is something you're going to do if a feature gets cut. Now, a design fallback isn't always, here's a replacement feature. Instead, it's here's what you have to do if you decide to remove this feature. Because features don't exist in a vacuum. They're interconnected to other things. And if you think you won't do this, if you're making anything but the most simplest game, and I've seen simple games that needed design fallbacks, you're going to do this. It will not be an if, it will be a when. This will happen to you for sure in every game you're doing. And the big point I want to make just up front is removing a feature is not free. It doesn't matter whether it's already been implemented or not. If you decide to remove something, it is going to take time. And this time is frequently overlooked by publishers and producers, especially inexperienced ones. Although I suspect that sometimes they know it's going to take time, but they don't want it to impact the schedule, so they act like this shouldn't be something taking up any time. It does. It takes time to remove the feature and then stitch up the game without it. That feature was put there for a reason. It may be balancing. It may be some place for the player to spend points. It may connect to a bunch of other features. So those related things have to be changed. Maybe some of them have to be removed. And then rebalancing has to happen. Sometimes your control scheme, the keyboard or controller scheme, has to be changed. Sometimes your game length will be affected. If you decide a quarter way into making a game that you're not going to include stealth or you're not going to include combat, that's going to dramatically change the length of your game, much more than if you decided to take a map out. So let's take a look at some of the things I've done. And also keep in mind that when you delete existing content, that means, because it takes time, that means there may be additional content that hasn't been implemented yet that won't be done because you've run out of time to do it. So sometimes removing something means something else won't get done either. This is complicated. I know it sounds complicated, but we're not in Game Dev 101 anymore. Design fallbacks and everything it entails are very much advanced game development. You will do this. You will do this on your games. I don't see a lot of people talking about it, so boom, let's have a whole video about it. Let me talk about examples of fallbacks and what you have to do if these features are cut. The two most common ones are you need to shorten the main quest line. For some reason, you don't have time to do it. Maybe you're out of time to make the assets that would be involved in those levels. Maybe the level designers just don't have time. They have the assets, but they simply don't have time to make those levels. Or maybe you don't have time to test those levels or light those levels or put in loot or additional exploration spaces or additional combat encounters that are just off the beaten path. So the entire main quest line gets shortened. This will have a lot of effects. First of all, the game just got shorter. The game length changed, which is obvious, but your publisher may be like, we wanted a 40-hour game. And you're like, you're getting a 30-hour game. This also changes your ratio of main to side quests, which, I've talked about a lot of my games. I want to keep that ratio about 80-20. Some games go 70-30. I've seen a few games that are 50-50. Once you start reducing main quests, by necessity, that ratio will change. You may want to change things based on that. Usually it's the main story quest that determines how much XP you're giving, because you want to know, because the main story quests have to be done, you want to know the minimum level the player can be when they reach the end of your game. Shorten that, you reduce what level they might be at. If that's acceptable, great. If it isn't acceptable, you're going to have to give more XP. You're going to have to go to all the previous quests, all of which are already done, maybe, and increase how much XP you get for them. Related to that, the second most common thing that you're going to be doing is just removing maps. I mentioned this. You may run out of time to make the map or light the map or make assets for the map or test the map, whatever. You are now taking out a map, which means the content that you were planning for that map either doesn't exist in the game anymore, it's been removed, or you move it to another map. That's why maps, when you're making a game, tend to be a little bigger than you need, and maybe you can fit it in somewhere. Maybe if it's critically important, you can fit it into the previous map or the next map in the sequence along the main story line. Note that this will increase the density on those remaining maps, which is something you're going to have to think about. Do you want it to be this dense? Do you want these points of interest to be this close together? Do you want it to feel like there's not a lot of buffer between like different encounters, and it will change the pacing of your game? See the previous one where I talked about the game length being changed and the main and side quest ratio being changed. Removing maps will do that too. Now here's some other things that you may end up doing in your game and how I think you have to handle it. Sometimes you may decide to remove melee. I've seen games that start with melee and ranged combat, and melee's not being used very much. It's not well balanced against range, and they decide to get rid of it. I mean, it's fine. It's mainly a game about guns anyway. Just so you know, that means skills are going to be lost. All the melee-related skills, which means you need to rebalance all the effects coming from attributes into skills. You need to redo the number of skill points you get when you level up, because there are fewer skills to buy into. You're going to have to remove all the perks and all the flaws and all the items in the game that are related to melee. So all the melee weapons are gone. You may want to question, though, do NPCs still do melee? Do you still want people coming at you with knives and swords and hammers? Even if the player doesn't use those, you have to decide. And then again, because melee's gone, you're definitely going to have to remap your control scheme. That all takes time. Another thing that I see commonly happen in games is you decide to change or remove minigames. Minigames are when you have a skill and there's associated minigame that you have to do to see if the skill is successful. These are really common for like lockpicking or hacking. You need to decide, if you don't have time to implement them, or you decide they're not fun, or you're just going to remove them or change them, well, you're going to have to check to see if the way the skill was used still makes sense without having a minigame associated. Maybe you should have other things involved. Like, do you want to still be able to walk up to any computer and use it, or will there be a minimum skill required, and if you click on the computer it says, sorry, you're not skilled enough to use this computer. You also want to consider if the minigame consumed resources, like if it used lockpicks or hacking devices. Will the skill still use that? And how will that be conveyed to the player? Because before, the minigame probably made it really obvious the resources were being consumed. A big thing that a lot of people forget is minigames usually paused the game. Some didn't. Some of you were trying to do that lockpicking and you were still being attacked. But usually the game paused. That will probably not occur anymore, which will change stealth pacing. When you get up to that locked door, if it doesn't pause the game when you're lockpicking it, or it doesn't pause the game when you're clicking the door to open it, that's going to change the rhythm of the game. It's going to change the player's impression of how stealth works. It's just something that's going to change, and you're going to have to see, is that change acceptable to you? Is this something you want in your game? I'm going to talk now about maybe removing swimming, but I'd say right now up front, this applies to all movement patterns. Let's say you wanted swimming in the game and then you decide to take it out. Probably because swimming adds a lot of animations, because moving underwater looks different, combat underwater looks different. Using skills underwater looks different. And there's a lot of UI associated with swimming because you go underwater, you got to hold your breath. Well, if you decide to take out swimming, any related swimming skills, swimming perks, swimming flaws, swimming items, all that stuff has to be removed. Then you have to remove all the underwater content. And if any of it was critical, if it was main story required or you just loved it, now you're going to have to move it. And it's going to be hard to move it because if it was designed to be underwater content, so the player could move freely in 3D, it may not work to just move it to another map. You may have to completely redesign it. Water, you have to think about what water is. Is water now a blocker? Like, can you not enter water at all, or can you go into the shallows but then you can't go any deeper? Is that visually presented to the player? You may have to go back and rethink your art if you decide to remove swimming. If water's a blocker, what happens if you fall into it? What happens if you're on a cliff above water and you fall into it? Does it kill you? Is it insta-kill? Does your game even support the concept of insta-kill? Is that being conveyed to the player? Or does landing in water make the player maybe black out and they wake up on shore? How does that work with encounters? If you have creatures that can still go in water, what if they attack the player from water? But the player can't enter water and the player doesn't have a ranged attack. You have to think of all these things. That's super important. And I've just touched the surface because this is true for all the movement types you have in the game. If you have parkour, climbing around on things, and you decide to take it out, what happens to your level design and what happens to NPCs that do parkour? What if you have flying in the game and then you decide to take it out? Can some enemies still fly? How do you attack flying creatures? What does this do to places that were originally designed to be reachable only through flight? And this can even apply to movement. Some games have a walk mode and a running mode, and you may decide to get rid of that and just have one mode. Well, you probably have a sprint bar or something for running. You probably have attributes and skills and flaws associated with running, and those are all gone. It's not simple to just go, oh yeah, we've taken out running, move on. Another thing that commonly is done is I've seen a lot, and this happened in my games, where originally I wanted dual wielding, and then for whatever reason, usually animation related, we just don't have time to do it. So now you suddenly are left with, instead of the player being able to have two one-handed melee weapons or two ranged weapons like two pistols, they can only have one. So you now have to rebalance all your items because you probably balanced the combat effects of like a pistol is only okay or a dagger is only okay, but so when you have two of them, that's the preferred mode. Or there were some really cool things they could do. There were some cool perks you could get, some cool attack modes. You're going to have to change all that and rebalance the existing weapons and skills to take into account that this doesn't exist anymore. Notice that rebalancing may affect things like weapon speed, weapon noise, ammo costs. It's a broad spectrum of things you're going to have to do. One thing that I see happens, and it happened in some of my games, is we originally wanted it to play in first and third person, and that didn't work. It was a lot of work because, especially for player animations, an animation that you use for first person player doesn't work for third person. So if you say are removing the third person camera option for the player, now you may have to go back and look at a lot of part of your game. Do some skills even make sense anymore, like dodging? Dodging may be something that looked good and made sense because the player could see somebody coming at them from the side and dodge. They can't see that in first person mode anymore. Now you're going to have to think about third person in-game cinematic camera features like dialogue or dying or the player doing emotes. Do those still look good in first person? If not, can you still have those in third person? Look at the reason you're removing third person. Maybe there were too many animations involved, but those animations are reduced heavily in death, dialogue, or emotes. And so you could still have those. So it might be a compromise. Rather than remove the feature, you're now compromising. Still a lot of work. Still got to make lists of animation. Animators still have to do a lot of work. But it may be that instead of removing the feature, you have a fallback of we don't have third-person camera everywhere, but in certain cases we do. A couple features that I've talked about whole videos about. Maybe you've decided to remove ammo from the game. Maybe you've listened to the people on your team who hate ammo, hate different types of ammo. don't get upset that their bow or their gun runs out of ammo and you decide to get rid of it. Well, you're definitely going to have to rebalance all your ranged weapons because ammo should have been part of the balancing concerns. Maybe this weapon has heavy ammo. Maybe this weapon has expensive ammo. Maybe this weapon goes through ammo quickly and has a long reload time. Those are all gone. More importantly, ammo was probably a money sink. And as I've said over and over again in a lot of my videos, it's hard to come up with money sinks in your game. That's why economies is hard to balance. It's the hard part is coming up with money sinks that the player has to do. Because if you're playing a character who's melee, hey, ammo, you never had to buy ammo. In fact, ammo was a money source for you. You found ammo and just sold it because, hey, you use a sword. You're going to have to rethink what to do when there's no ammo in your game. And then similarly with encumbrance. I have a whole video on encumbrance. But if you decide, I'm not going to have encumbrance in my game anymore, you're going to have to rebalance attributes. You're going to have to remove perks and flaws that have to do with encumbrance. You're going to have to make a full pass through all your existing items and any system that uses items like crafting to try to decide what you're going to do now that you don't have encumbrance. Your UI will probably have to be redesigned. It is a lot of work. So I hope I've come to the end of my list. I hope this made you realize how difficult design fallbacks are to make, how difficult it is to actually implement a design fallback when the time comes, and it will come. It's not an if, it's a when. If you make any sufficiently complex game, you will eventually have to make a decision to remove feature or remove a content and then fall back. So my conclusion here for you is please design these fallbacks early and put them in your design document so other people can read them, comment on them, and then when you need to use them, and you will, you can just pull that ripcord as quickly as possible, get the work done, get that work behind you, rejuggle your schedule to see now what you have time left to do, and move on. Whew. That was a long discussion of design fallbacks, but I hope you found it useful.